you so much. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure being here today. Welcome to my webinar about change. I hope that you're going to leave with some solid information that you can start putting into action today. Today we're going to be discussing change and why it's so difficult to do, whether it's on an individual or organizational level. There are, of course, many great frameworks out there to guide you through organizational change. However, with any change initiative, it's imperative to keep in mind it's not organizations that change, it's people that do. Therefore, even frameworks can fall short in capturing why it's so difficult to change and what to do about it. So my goal for this webinar is to teach you all a bit about psychology and neuroscience behind change, to arm you with a deeper understanding of what to do when you face resistance on an organizational level or even on a personal level, because obviously that's happening all the time. Then, of course, I'll be giving you a few strategies to counteract resistance. So let's get started, and what better way to get started than through a story? I'd like to tell you a story of hope and my own personal experience with resistance to change. Although it's a bit of an embarrassing story, I think it's helpful when it comes to uncovering some of the factors at play for all of us when we're faced with difficult change. So it starts like this. I own two businesses. One is called Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services, and it's a large psychology practice based in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States, and it employs around 19 therapists. The other business that I own is a leadership consulting firm called Equilibria Leadership Consulting. Several years ago, Equilibria Psychological was much smaller, but was growing rapidly. And it was clear to me that it was time to hire an office manager. And an office manager in a medical practice is responsible for things like insurance billing, referrals for clients, and handling the day-to-day issues that arise in a practice. I admittedly was desperate at this point to hire someone as I was traveling all over the place for Equilibria Leadership Consulting and running leadership development programs and coaching folks, and I just couldn't be in two places at once. So my first face-to-face encounter with change was making the decision that I had to give up some control and hire someone to look after the business. Many of us on this webinar can probably relate to that bittersweet moment in your business when you had to decide to relinquish some control in order to grow. I don't know about you, but that was quite a struggle. So that was my first kind of face-to-face with change. Anyhow, I met Hope, and Hope was 28, and when she grew up, she wanted to be a psychologist like me, and she didn't know the first thing about office management, but that was something I could teach her. I mean, I'm a people developer and coach after all. Even though I had a bad gut feeling about her, as I mentioned, I was a bit desperate, truthfully, so I hired her. And by the way, on a side note, always take your gut seriously. Gut instinct isn't psychological frou-frou. Gut instinct is based on wisdom, and wisdom is based on experience. So there's a reason why you feel the way you do sometimes. Anyway, going back, I met with Hope, and I had this terrible gut instinct in my belly, but I was desperate, as I said, and so I hired her. And from day one, Hope messed up. Keep in mind, mess-ups in a medical practice can equate to office fraud or malpractice, so mess-ups are a rather big deal. However, I was a good boss. I would take her out for coffee and coach her to help her problem solve her lack of attention to detail, her disorganization, her abrasive personality, her seeming inability to grasp any part of the work, and so on. I mean, when I say Hope was a mess up, I mean Hope was a mess up. Needless to say, we had a lot of coffee that year. Anyway, over the course of the year, the culture of Equilibria Psychological started declining rapidly. Once a very cool, close, down-to-earth feeling culture now became a stressed-out, angry, tense culture. The clinicians were angry because Hope could not be relied on, and in hindsight, ultimately, they were angry at me because I wouldn't get rid of her and do something about the problem. So over the course of the year, I was so stressed out. I was snappy. I was overwhelmed. I was spending more time cleaning up her mistakes than if I was just doing everything myself. Yet, I still could not fire her, and that's why this is so embarrassing. In addition, I should mention, her mistakes were costing me thousands and thousands of dollars in business that already had a business that already had slim profit margins. After a year, I sat Hope down and to have yet another progress meeting with her. At that point, I told her I wanted to give her a raise, but I couldn't give her one because of her poor performance. She told me, and this is a quote, "I completely understand, but you need to understand how hard it is for me to be 28 years old and to have my father pay for my cell phone, my vacations, and my credit cards." I didn't think I heard her straight, so I asked her to repeat herself, and she did. And so when I said to her, well, if you want to raise or if you need more money, then maybe you could improve your own performance or get another part-time job because you're only working part-time for me. But then she said back to me and she quoted, "But this is my fun year." As you can imagine, I went from the leader that was letting her ship sink to an even worse leader, single-handedly dunking the ship under the water so it would sink. Anyway, Hope eventually handed in her resignation as her father was paying for a month-long European vacation. And then when she came back, she was going to find herself, quote, a real job. That was quite a stab in the gut. So why didn't I let her go versus her let me go? Why couldn't I fire her when I needed to fire her? Why couldn't I give up on the idea that I could change her? Why was I willing to risk everything over just changing my mindset? All these questions smack me in the face over and over again. What was even more painful about this was not only did I write a book on how to manage millennials, which was my first book in 2009, I get paid to work with leaders and managers to help them excel. And to boot, I'm a psychologist, so I'm technically supposed to have some self-awareness and insight into my behaviors. But nope, I derailed both personally and professionally because I was so resistant to change and to doing things differently. I was, in fact, too busy to win, too proud to see, and too afraid to lose. The three most common personal and professional derailers. Although all of them are so important to talk about, today we're delving into being too proud to see, otherwise known as being too resistant to change. Being resistant to change is one of the most human things about being human. Change is tough, and we're designed to resist it at all costs. In fact, change actually triggers the same part of the brain that's triggered when a gun is held to your head. Your brain doesn't know the difference whether a gun's being held to your head or you're being asked to do something differently, but it certainly responds the same way. So whether it be implementing a new system-wide initiative or changing what you eat for breakfast after eating the same thing every morning for 10 years, change is really, really, really tough when you talk about how we're built and how our brains work. One of the reasons why change is so tough is because change disrupts your equilibrium. So the problem is your entire body is designed to maintain equilibrium. When one thing is out of whack, everything else in your system works hard to regain that equilibrium. The definition of change, however, is to challenge a state of equilibrium and challenge the status quo. So naturally, change wreaks havoc on the human brain and the human body, which is why it's so common to experience so much resistance on a personal level if you're trying to change something, or you see so much crazy resistance in other people on an organizational level, even when you're trying to change the smallest thing. Basically, it's natural. It's human to resist and to completely have a meltdown around it. There are a ton of psychological and neurological reasons why people resist change, and they include things like perception, emotion, our different temperaments, group dynamics, how groups work together, resilience, people's different levels of resilience, people's levels of grit, people's different mindsets, and the list goes on and on and on. But since we only have a little time together today, I want to focus on something that we can all sink our teeth into, because we all probably can recall times in our own personal and professional lives when we've been guilty of this. And that's letting our psychological biases get in the way of change. So understanding some of the common psychological biases at play when it comes to change is going to arm you with tools that every individual or organizational change initiative needs. And that tool is self-awareness. And seriously, once you understand this stuff, then you can do things to counteract it. So keeping in mind throughout this whole talk that we're going to have today, the truth, there's something that's true of us all. So when it comes to changing almost anything, whether that be a belief, a prejudice, a hairstyle, friends, or even what you're eating for breakfast, basic psychology and the way the brain works can interfere with critical thinking and decision making. And it happens because of three things. One, we seldom welcome change gladly. Two, the brain's hardwiring predisposes us to habitual routine behavior and decision making. And three, we let psychological biases influence our reaction to change and our ability to make decisions that cause change. So let's explore some of the reasons why this happens. And I have to add this caveat. This is a very small group of reasons that I'm giving you. Like I said, there's tons and tons of psychology and neuroscience behind this, but because of our short period of time, I'm going to capture some things that you can really sink your teeth into. So let's talk about the first one, which is ego depletion and exhaustion. So new and unfamiliar routines and choices challenge our comfort zone of our ingrained habits. Again, like I said, we're very habitual creatures. When you affect a change, you force yourself out of that comfort zone. And it takes a ton of energy. And it can wear you out. In the same way that your muscles eventually give out during a strenuous workout, your mental muscle starts to lose function at full speed, hampering your ability to care, make choices, maintain motivation, weigh decisions, and ultimately take actions. So psychologists call this ego depletion. It's a state of mind where you can lose critical elements of your self-control and all the other mental processes that require focus and conscious effort. So this really cool study was done in 1998 by researcher Roy Baumeister and his colleagues. It was a very simple but very, very interesting study. They called it the radish and chocolate chip cookie eating study. So in this study, the researchers had three groups. One group was a chocolate chip eating group, one group was a radish eating group, and the last group was a control group. So the chocolate chip cookie eating group and the radish eating group, both of those groups were asked separately to come into a room that smelled like these delicious, freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. And on a table in this room was a bowl of these beautiful red radishes and a plate of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies and chocolates. So let's start with the radish eating group. So the radish eating group, I'm sorry about that. So the radish eating group was asked to come in, and they were told to take 2 to 3 radishes, that they could take 2 to 3 radishes, but could not touch the chocolate chip cookies or the chocolates. And then the chocolate chip cookie eating group was asked to come in, and they were told that they could nosh on about 2 to 3 chocolate chip cookies or chocolates, but they couldn't touch the radishes. Then all three groups were asked separately to go into a separate room and solve this unsolvable, very, very difficult problem. So the question is, who gave up first? The radish eating group, the chocolate chip eating group, or the control group? And the people that gave up first were the radish eating group. Why? So the reason why is most of us, when we're faced with radishes or freshly baked cookies, would rather eat a cookie, right? The radish eaters were told they could not eat the cookies, however, or at least they were asked, please make the decision not to eat the chocolate chip cookies. They were asked to make a choice to follow the instructions, demonstrate self-restraint, and not eat the cookies. So by the time they got to the problem, they had already used up so much energy that they were more depleted and then gave up much quicker on the problem than either the control group or the chocolate chip cookie eating group. So let's step back for a second and let's think about this in our own lives. You make so many choices throughout the day. You wake up, your alarm goes off. You make the choice about whether or not you're going to wake up or press snooze. Then you have to, once you get up, you have to make a decision about whether or not you're going to take a shower, and hopefully you make the right one. Then you make the decision about what to wear, and that can be pretty brutal. Then what to eat for breakfast, then what the kids will wear, what they will eat, which route you're going to drive to work, and so on and so on and so on. By the time you get to work, you have made so many choices and so many decisions, even though they might seem stupid and simple to you, that you've already been depleted. And thus, you're more susceptible to poor decision making and increased resistance to change or doing something differently than the way you've always done it. This is why all big decisions, on a side note, especially those around change, should be done first thing in the morning, Because again, by the time 8 or 9 o'clock comes around, by the time you get to work, you're already depleted from all of these small, tiny choices that you've had to make. And this is really interesting. This is a picture of Steve Jobs, throughout the decades. So this is why some of the most successful people we know, like Steve Jobs and like Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, wore the same outfit every single day. Jobs with his iconic pair of jeans and black turtleneck, Zuckerberg with his hoodies. Taking away just this simple decision of what you're going to wear, like having a uniform, actually makes more room for important challenges, decisions, and change situations for you to cope with. So tying this back into the hope story I told you earlier, how many times, for those of you on the call, how many times have you just stayed put in a work situation or in a personal relationship that you should have left? A lot of this comes down to simply being mentally exhausted and not being able to think as clearly as you would like, because remember, change makes us move away from that equilibrium that our brain and our bodies naturally crave and are designed to establish. Change is a disruption in that equilibrium. So making a decision that's different than what we normally do is very, very difficult and requires a ton of energy that our bodies do not want to give up. So oftentimes we will stay in that the way we've always done things situation just because we're mentally exhausted, even if you don't even recognize it. So ego depletion is something we all experience and something to keep in mind when you're faced with personal change initiatives or even large-scale ones. Now I want to move on to some very common universal psychological biases that we all have been guilty of from time to time. And the first one I want to talk about is the sunk cost bias. So some of you on this call have heard of the Aeropostale BAC supersonic transport, the SST, which is more famously known as the famous Concorde jet. So the Concorde was jointly funded by the British and French governments, and it was an impressive but extremely costly achievement. The jet dazzled the eyes with its sleekness and the mind with its swiftness. It became increasingly apparent, though, that the Concorde would never achieve a return on the huge cost the two governments had sunk into it. So what did the governments do? They sank even more money and time and energy into the project. Losses mounted until finally in 2003 and 2004, Air France and British Airways finally decided to cut their losses. And so that's why sometimes the sunk cost bias is called the Concorde fallacy. So this phenomenon is called the sunk cost bias. It says that the more time, money, and energy you put into something, especially a bad decision, bad products, or a bad hire, the more time, money, and energy you will invest in that person, place, or thing. So think back to the hope story I told you all at the beginning of this webinar. Technically, I should have fired her after her first week, but I had put so much time, money, and effort into her employment and into my own decision to hire her and that I could train her and coach her that I just couldn't get myself to cut the cord. And if you think about it in your own life, are there any bad hires, decisions, or products you've held on to way, way past their expiration point? I bet if you look into that, you could point to the sunk cost bias. Again, it's very, very, very common, and we all run into this situation, and that's why I'm presenting it. It's such a natural thing that occurs with all of us. Another psychological bias that keeps us saying things like, let's not rock the boat, or this is the way we've always done it, so why change? Or, the famous, I'll start next Monday. It's called the status quo bias. Instead of considering all available information when we make a decision, especially a decision to change, people tend to rely on information that represents the current state or on previous choices that create current conditions, whether they or someone else made those choices or not. Status quo bias includes the natural tendency to do three things. So the first thing is refrain from action altogether because you'd rather do nothing than make a mistake. So think back to your own lives with that. Because a lot of us are fear making a mistake, or might be in a situation that, or an environment or a workplace or a relationship where making a mistake is actually scolded versus appreciated, we might refrain from action altogether because we don't want to make that mistake. Status quo bias also includes the natural tendency to favor current routine over new options. And status quo bias also includes the natural tendency to view current conditions favorably, because that provides a measure of comfort. Now, we don't have time to get into all of the things psychologically that happen in our brains, like justification and rationalization, that make us convince ourselves that current conditions might be more favorable. But these three things are incredibly natural human things that occur in all of our human brains. Humans want things to stay the same, period. People want things to stay the same. Remember, all of our systems work together to maintain equilibrium at all costs. Any shift from that balanced state wreaks havoc mentally and personally, and can deplete us. So status quo, we want things to stay the same. One other very brief psychological bias I want to talk about is loss aversion. It's a very common psychological bias and has to do with the fact that when you contemplate making a decision that involves change, for example, like leaving a job or taking a new one, withdrawing support from a failing project, or adapting to changing market forces. So when you contemplate making this decision that involves change, you worry about a potential loss. For example, you worry about you won't find a better new job, or your new job is going to turn into a nightmare, or that if you leave that project you've been working on, actually if you stayed one more day, it'll get back on track tomorrow, or the new market force represents a fad, not a genuine shift. So you worry that, will the decision rob us of current benefits? Will desired benefits actually materialize? What if we bet the farm and end up losing it? What will people think if we fall flat on our faces? These questions quite often convince us to stay mired in the mud of the status quo. So the pain of loss for human beings is twice as strong as the reward felt from gain. So we are more likely to hold on to money. Like when we're betting, it's more painful to bet $50 than it is to gain $100. More painful to bet 50 than gain 100. So there are, of course, a ton of more psychological biases that come into play when faced with change. But these are so common and so easily understood, as we have all been guilty of them from time to time. In fact, these are so common that they have taken down some of the most successful companies in the United States. Consider, for example, the stories of Borders, Kodak, and Blockbuster. I want to just briefly run through these with you. So in 1975, Kodak innovators developed one of the first digital cameras. Despite the extensive expertise, massive resources, and unrivaled past success, Sony seized the lead by launching its digital camera in the early 1980s. It took Kodak almost 20 years to make a serious foray into the digital market with its EasyShare line. Making a decision to let go into a new business line when your legacy business is failing is a very, very difficult thing to do. However, as we all know, you must adapt to survive. So eventually, Kodak filed for bankruptcy in January 2012 as a result of "this is the way it's always been done" type of thinking. It is deeply ingrained in human nature to develop and hold on to habits, both good and bad, because they provide this warm, cozy cocoon. We turn our backs on compelling reasons to change, whether it's a threat to our health from eating junk food or smoking cigarettes, or the danger posed to our business by market shifts or declining revenues. Again, if a big giant like Kodak could go down from that kind of thinking, from "this is the way it's always done" thinking, all of us are susceptible to this. I want to quickly explore Blockbuster, because this was fascinating. Blockbuster had a huge opportunity, totally ruined its chances. So Blockbuster, for those of you that might not be familiar, is the company that provided home video and video game rentals through brick and mortar rental shops. They filed for bankruptcy on September 23rd, 2010, because they also failed to adapt. What happened was Netflix, famous for online streaming, approached Blockbuster to join forces. They had this great idea, and they said, look, hey, who's a leader in this industry? Let's work with Blockbuster, and let's do let's do at-home shipping of video rentals, and then eventually online streaming. And Blockbuster had the resources, they had the money, they had the talent, but Blockbuster decided they didn't want a bunch. They wanted to do things as they always had done things. And so by the time Blockbuster reacted to the threat in 2004 with the online DVD rental delivery service, it had already put one foot squarely in the grave. And that's why Netflix is where Netflix is, and that's why Blockbuster is no longer. Last but not least, Borders, very fascinating, Borders bookstore. So while Amazon was gaining momentum, its competitor, Borders' competitor, Barnes & Noble, decided to invest in its online commerce, while Borders decided to do things as they had always done and invest in their brick and mortar stores. Needless to say, Borders went under for its why rock the boat type of thinking, while Barnes & Noble is still in business and has a strong online presence, as well as still has brick and mortar stores. These are only a few of the biggies when it comes to psychological biases, but all of them rest on the premise that we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. So we like to see things the way we like to see things, and we like to hear things the way we like to hear things. I'm sure you can think of your own personal relationships and your personal friendships where this is the case. And why is this, you may ask? Well, there's a quote by Deepak Chopra that I absolutely love that sums it all up. We have approximately 60,000 thoughts a day. 95% of those thoughts are the same thoughts we had yesterday. So basically what this is saying is we're prisoners of the same old story. We think about the same things over and over and over again. And we have to do this psychologically speaking, because if you let all the input from all of your senses come in at any given moment, it would completely overwhelm you. Instead, what your brain does is it filters out. It filters out information so you could actually process and focus on what you have to focus on. And our brains operate through mental models. So I want to briefly describe what a mental model is, because this is so imperative when you understand the psychology and neuropsychology behind change and what people go through. So basically, what a mental model is that we have mental models for everything we do in life. And they are shaped, and they start with how we're brought up, our socialization, who we're raised around, where the environment we're raised, our personal characteristics, things we experienced in the schoolyard, like bullying, our friendships, whatever it might be. This is our personal baggage. Personal baggage is often associated with a negative thing, but it's not. It's just what our stuff is. And this personal baggage creates the lenses that we see through. And through those lenses, we have interpretations of things. So you on this call might see a situation, like if a situation happened in front of it, because of your upbringing and your socialization and your history, your personal baggage, you're going to see and interpret that situation very differently than I'm going to interpret that situation. And those interpretations shape our beliefs, and our beliefs shape how we think. How we think shapes what we feel, and ultimately what we feel shapes our behaviors and our responses. This is why you may approach change one way, while your colleague approaches change another. It's our mental models that shape our perception, and perception shapes our emotions and influence our reactions. This is why it's so imperative to keep in mind that it's not organizations that change, it's people that change. And when you understand that, you understand why one colleague might have a very extreme reaction to a very minor change, while other colleagues are very resilient to it and seem totally fine with it. So before we discuss ways to counteract some of these biases, let's just recap some of the main points. So 1, we quickly and efficiently process information that matches our way of knowing the world. And these points that I'm pointing out are fundamental human characteristics about the way our brains work. So 1, we quickly and efficiently process information that matches our way of knowing the world. 2, we tend to remember information that supports our mental models, that supports our view of the world. 3, we tend to resist information that contradicts our mental models or our view of the world. And 4, we shape our perceptions and expectations of others, our environment, and of ourselves according to our view of the world or according to our mental models. And everyone's mental model is quite different. Oops. So these are just some of the reasons why we often resist change. And like I said, there's many, many other things that come into play when you're talking about change, like perception, emotion, people's level of resilience, people's temperament, the grit and mindset of an individual or of a group or of a culture. So all of these factors do come into play. However, I just wanted to present something that we can all bite our teeth in because we can experience and relate to it so much. So one of the main takeaways, again, I'm going to say it for a 5th or 6th time, organizations don't change, people do. And that's why the research has shown that close to 70% of change initiatives fail, where only 30% are successful. It's the organizations that take into account the fact that they have to work with the human side of change that often are successful, versus the organizations that follow a step-by-step framework through change, because again, people are going to experience it differently. So let's talk about a few ways that you can counteract or manage other people's resistance to change. First and foremost, know, teach, and counteract biases. When people have self-awareness, they're more able to recognize roadblocks and work around them. All of you on this call are more self-aware than you were before, simply by learning some of these very basic human factors about our psychological biases that we all share. Educating other people only helps, as the more people know, the better able they are to recognize the signs and symptoms of bias versus the reality that might be going on. Again, if you're sitting in a meeting with a group of people and you recognize that everyone's kind of getting on the same bandwagon with a product that they've been pushing for a long time that hasn't been producing realistic good results, then you can probably point out in the group and teach people like, hey, is the sunk cost bias at play here? Or are we actually seeing the reality of the situation? Taking away all of our emotion, taking away our feelings and our devotion to this product that we're pushing, what's really going on here? Again, the more people that understand the psychological biases that are at play that are very natural, the more help you have at kind of dispelling them and counteracting them so you can get to the reality of a situation. 2, position change in an employee's or a person's best interest. Change is often resisted because it's seen as a threat to the status quo, a threat to the way an individual understands their role, their job, their function, or how they tie into the greater picture. You know, for example, you know, some more old school companies that might be integrating tablets or a certain technology that other companies have done well before, but you know, like utility companies integrating tablets or technology into their work. That can be incredibly threatening to someone who's done a job for 25, 30 years one way using paper and pencil, and then all of a sudden is being asked to integrate some piece of technology into their work, even though it's absolutely going to help their jobs in the long run. That can feel very threatening because it's a new way to do something. It's a new way to understand that, a new way for that person to understand their own role, to understand how they fit in, to understand how it's going to work with them, work for them, or work against them. So even though to you it might seem like a no-brainer, to the person actually having to do it and live with the change, it can be incredibly disruptive. So helping people understand how the change will impact them, both good and bad, being very transparent about that, helps people know what to expect. And when you know what to expect, you're less resistant. When you know what you're walking into, you are less resistant. And I think we can all relate to that in some way. 3, Provide an opportunity to speak freely and encourage open dialogue. Being able to have a say in things allows people to have ownership. And when humans feel ownership in things, they're more likely to work with versus work against. In addition, just like in any relationship, when you have an opportunity to talk through things in an open, welcoming forum, you're more likely to start seeing other perspectives and other ways of doing things. Dialogue is an enhancer, not a detractor. And again, what applies in our personal relationships actually really does apply in the organizational culture or in the organizational relationship. It's no different. We're people in our personal lives and we're people in our work lives. There's no difference. So obviously having this open dialogue is going to help people see other perspectives, just like it would in a one-on-one conversation in your personal life. So as you can see, some of the suggestions I'm giving you are kind of really rooted in common sense. I think sometimes when we transfer personal to professional, though, we think it has to be so different. The next suggestion is manage your personal reactions when you hear something you don't want to hear. And this is often one of the hardest things to do because you're human too. You might get resistant or defensive, especially if you're really a fan of the change to come. The minute you go there, though, you're closing down the conversation and instigating resistance. And remember, resistance begets resistance. Openness begets openness. But I also have to add a caveat here. It's not only what you say, it's also how you look. So sometimes you might just be listening and keeping your mouth shut and biting your tongue, but your anger or how you feel about something is all over your face, and I call this leaky face. So when I say manage your personal reactions when you hear something you don't want to hear in order to encourage the open dialogue, I'm not just talking about what comes out of your mouth. I'm also talking about your body language, how you look, your tone, and all of that. And that is often harder to control than what comes out of our mouths. Encourage a growth mindset. This is very important, and I could talk for hours and hours on this. So although we don't have time today to delve into the research by Carol Dweck on mindset, some of the most successful personal as well as company-wide change initiatives occur because a growth mindset was cultivated. A growth mindset means that people believe their abilities can be developed through dedication and hard work, meaning that brains and talent are just a starting point. This view, this growth mindset, accepts that mistakes and setbacks are going to occur and that those only aid in learning and growing through the change. This is compared with a fixed mindset, either in an individual or an organization, where people believe their basic qualities, like their intelligence or talent, are fixed traits that cannot be developed. A growth mindset organization or individual honors the struggle of change. It welcomes it, in fact, and keeps the line of what's working and what's not working and why open so that all people can learn and grow together. And this leads us to our next point. Keep the what's working and what's not dialogue open and frequent. This allows individuals to share lessons learned, problems encountered, and think about ways to make it even better. Without this open dialogue, people shut down and the emotion can just start interfering. So what I'm saying here with this what's working, what's not open dialogue, with the encouraging the growth mindset and encouraging the open dialogue in general, what you're doing here with any kind of initiative, whether it be a personal initiative like stopping smoking or not eating chocolate anymore, whether it be a huge organizational initiative like integrating new technology, mistakes are going to happen. Problems are going to happen. Concerns are going to happen. Emotions are going to happen. Resistance is going to happen. If you cut that off and don't allow for it to happen or penalize based on the mistakes or scold or whatever it might be, then you're shutting people down and creating increased resistance. Mistakes are good because mistakes point out that, okay, we need to maybe adjust the process a little bit or change the process a little bit, or maybe we need more training or need to show people how to do things a little bit differently, or we're learning that this doesn't work, maybe we can try it a different way. This creates that kind of open dialogue, that open growth mindset, so change can really take effect and people can get on board. Another point I want to make is steer clear of change fatigue. That's a real thing. Too much change all at once, just like ego depletion, like we talked about with the radishes and chocolate chip cookies, can make all of these efforts null and void. You can't do a million different changes all at once in your personal life or in organizational life. People actually do get very fatigued and can only take so much. So one of the things I'd like to add is the concept of small wins. So one way to do little changes and to not fatigue people is to allow for small wins. As we know, progress, even a small amount of progress, helps to shift one's mindset and encourage motivation and perseverance. At the end of the day, successful change is rooted in perseverance, grit, and resilience. It's being able to pick oneself up after falling down and trying it again and again. Having these small wins actually is what helps people stay in the game. So the last point I want to bring up is about emotional contagion. And again, I could talk for hours on this, but I want to just wrap it up in a couple of minutes. Emotional contagion is one of the most fascinating phenomenons that happens all the time. And it's something that you need to control when you're instigating a change initiative, but it's something you can also harness. So let me briefly describe what emotional contagion is. As humans, we mimic one another. So when we're born, hopefully mommy smiles at us and we smile back. And if mommy frowns, we frown back. And when you smile, the muscles in your face trigger all these physiological responses that signal, that send a signal to the emotional center in your brain, which is one of the most powerful parts of your brain. And that produces the feeling of happiness. And when you frown, the muscles send off these physiological responses that produce the feeling of sadness, and so on and so on and so on. So basically, emotions are neurological firings. However, as you know from your own life, if you're around someone that's miserable and unhappy, you start feeling that way after a while. It becomes contagious. And if you're around someone that's upbeat and happy, you start feeling that way also after a while. Basically, what I'm trying to say is we impact each other emotionally very, very quickly, to the point where it can become highly, highly contagious. That's often how good cultures go from good to bad. That's how relationships go from good to bad, how teams go from good to bad. This emotional contagion stuff is very, very, very powerful, especially if you don't nip it in the bud. So in any change initiative, when negative emotions are not managed, that negative contagion can spread like wildfire, just as much as when positive emotions spread. So if the negative emotions are starting, and negative emotions often start because we're not changing with a growth mindset, because we're not encouraging open dialogue, because we're just kind of doing the do as I say and shut up. I'm not actually going to listen to the feedback. But as a leader, it's important to try to capture the positive emotional contagion. And positive emotional contagion is more likely when you create that open environment, that open dialogue, that what's working, what's not dialogue. So as a leader, when you follow some of the things I suggested, which tie into basic human nature, you are increasing the chances of positive contagion. When you follow a very sterile model and try to fit everyone into that framework, you're more apt to trigger negativity and negative emotional contagion. So as I mentioned earlier in this discussion, the process of individual or organizational change is a massive topic. I like to think of individual change kind of as a microcosm of organizational change, because always remember it's people that will change. We have clearly only scratched the surface. When it comes to change, you have to take into consideration more about how the brain works, perception, emotion, other biases, and all the other aspects that play into initiating a successful shift in habits and routines. But for now, with our surface scratching, are there any questions or comments?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nicole, for a very, very interesting presentation. Now, let me go straight to the question and answers. Folks, we are open for the Q&A session. If you have any questions, you could either put it in the question box or you could raise your hand. I see their hand already raised, so let me go straight to the caller. We have Mr. Sandeep Waite. Mr. Sandeep, could you please introduce yourself and ask the question? Mr. Sandeep, can you hear us? Hello? Hello. I'm afraid cannot have an audio connection with you. So let me go straight to the question box. We have a question from Brother Muhammad Al Mahmoud. The question is, sunk cost sounds similar to the management concept of escalation of commitment. Are they the same thing?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what the second part was.
Sunk cost sounds similar to the management concept of escalation of commitment. Are they the same thing?
Ah, I see. Thank you. Well, the sunk cost bias, it could be, but sunk cost bias in particular is a psychological bias that was identified by behavioral economists. So behavioral economists have contributed a ton to our understanding about psychology and decision making and reactions to change. So the sunk cost bias in particular is a psychological bias that occurs. I'm assuming that that's something that's been wrapped up into the other management theory.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another one. We have Maram Alfia raised her hand.
Hello?
Maram, hello, yes, Sister Maram. Could you please introduce yourself and ask the question?
Yes. So, yeah, my name is Maram. I'm working with the Batarji Medical College in Saudi Arabia. So my question is, like, I know someone who got into a phase of denial from all the changes that happened recently in their life. So how can you, like, accept those changes? I know she talked about that small changes and small wins, it's what counts more than big changes. So how can that person accept those changes?
And I just want to make sure I heard you, that you said that a friend of yours had gone through a ton of changes all at once and is having trouble accepting.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So
yeah, basically going through a phase of denial.
Denying them. Okay. Well, you know, it's interesting. And are these, and you said you worked at a medical college, are these kind of uncontrollable changes, things that were out of his control?
I guess so, like moving from one country to the other, like going through different phases from your life, like graduating from high school, going to college, and all happening in different countries, not in one country.
Right. That's so hard. So I think there's something else that we have to talk about when we talk about change, especially coming from a psychological and neuropsychological perspective. Again, that change fatigue thing I brought up, there's only so much, you know, there's only so much that we can handle until we start kind of shutting down certain parts. And it doesn't mean like, you know, we're letting things slip. It's just like our brains are designed to handle what it can handle at a certain time and to push ourselves. Right? And so sometimes we deal and process with stuff much later than other people might expect us to deal. So for example, let's take grief, because that's one of the biggest, you know, even though this is not talking about business, often business models follow the grief model. When you lose someone, we often expect people to grieve in a certain way, in a certain time. You know, but the thing is, sometimes the human brain just shuts it off for a little bit until that person is ready to cope with what they need to cope with. So that's why I'm saying some denial is absolutely normal, but starting to letting it for a while, it's normal. It can become a problem if the person's like functioning, it's starting to decompensate. So I think the small wins concept is very important. I think allowing for the space to talk about it and to process it and to vent. Venting is one of the most powerful tools we have as humans. And that's why I always talk about that open dialogue, because sometimes that's all we need is to just have a big vent session to get it all out, you know?
Yes.
And also things like acknowledging. Even if the person's not seeing that they've gone through a lot, acknowledging, like, wow, you have gone through a ton this past year. You have moved to, like, this many countries. You've gone through major, major milestones, and you are really holding up well. How are you feeling about all this? Like, starting the conversation and acknowledging what the person's been through. because ultimately, the other thing I want to add is that we all have different levels of resilience in life, you know? You also might be dealing with a very resilient person, so I think just bringing it up and allowing for the open dialogue can help a lot.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sister Maram, for interesting question. Let me go straight to another caller who raised a hand. We have Siva Ramalgam. Siva, could you please introduce yourself and ask a question? Siva, can you hear us? Okay. Let me go straight to, okay, we have a supplementary question from Brother Muhammad. Said, I've studied and heard that loss aversion has some sort of correlation ties with culture. For example, Eastern or Middle Eastern cultures have more tendency to be affected by this bias. What do you think? Are there any organizational success for corporations to reduce, eliminate its effect?
We cut out on that last piece. So what I heard was that different cultures might deal with loss aversion differently.
Yeah. And the last one was, are there any organizational success for corporations to reduce or eliminate its effect?
Eliminate the loss aversion effect. Okay. You know, I would say that yes, I'm sure there are cultural differences, but I would argue that there's person-to-person differences. Because even if a certain culture maybe does better with loss aversion, certain people might not. And the loss aversion thing really, again, in my belief, from my understanding of neuroscience and my understanding of psychology as a psychologist, it's a very individual thing. So again, the more self-aware we are of these psychological biases, whether it be loss aversion or any of the tons that there are out there, the more aware that we are, the less likely we are to fall victim to them, if that makes sense. So you might have someone for one culture who's very, very aware of this, and you might have an organization that's very aware of this and that actually teaches these biases and teaches people this type of self-awareness. They're going to be less likely to fall victim to this kind of problem. I think a great example of a company that that has kind of stepped out of being victim from psychological biases is actually Netflix. Netflix has a very interesting policy, and you know, other companies are following suit. They are not about and this is like loss aversion in the sense of like the traditional workplace that I'm talking about. They are not about you have to work 40, 50 hours a week, you have to be here from 9 to 5. They are not about that. They actually reward people that can figure out how to work in less time and come up with the best product. They're about production, creativity, innovation. So that's where they focus their time, and they don't care when it's done, how it's done. This is the same as Google, right? They allow for, and this is a very big deal in the United States, they allow, I think they just passed a rule that women can have up to a year in maternity leave. I think that was just passed. That's a huge, huge step from traditional United States culture, organizational culture, operations. They don't have budgets, spending budgets. They don't watch over what you're spending. They just say, you know what, spend money like this was your own money. Like be mindful of how you're spending our money. Pretend it's your own money. Like they really trust their employees, and that's about thinking about like not what we're going to lose. Like if you're not working these 40 hours, it's not what we're going to lose. It's what we're going to gain if we allow people to work in a way that they're going to be the most creative and that they're going to be the most productive. So companies like Netflix, companies like Google are fighting that status quo, are fighting that loss aversion, are fighting that sunk cost bias stuff, are fighting these psychological biases and doing a fantastic job. And everyone wants to work there because of this. So I hope I answered your question.
Well, Thank you very much. So I hope so. And let me move to another caller who's raised her hand. We have Sister Atia Ali. Atia Ali, I believe you have muted yourself, so could you please unmute and ask a question? Atia Ali, you need to unmute your microphone. So while you're doing it, let me move to another caller. We have Brother Muhammad Ali Al-Ahrash. Brother Muhammad, your mic is also on the mute by default. So could you please unmute and ask the question? Brother Muhammad Ali. Okay, let me go to our other regular caller. We have Dr. Muhammad Rashad. Dr. Muhammad, could you please ask the question?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Nicole, for such a great presentation. And just to compliment on the Netflix, they have one of the best HR policy, especially the vacation policy, where the employees is not supposed to give a lot of details about or beforehand confirmation to his boss about the time of the vacation. So I think it's more empowerment, and that has yielding some kind of results. My quick question is about, is there any correlation between this change with the age, like you being the psychologist? So is that the age factor makes an impact on the change? And what can be the strategies, like especially in the midst, because now you see the CEOs are more young and they are like 30s and 40s compared to 1980s when like a company like Kodak or Ford or somewhere had the CEOs usually, or GE, usually at the age of 65 or 70 years. So has the age makes impact on this change management?
That's such a great question. I am going to surmise here, because I haven't done, the research I've done is on generations and kind of the psychology and how it's impacting workplace, but I haven't looked at it specifically with change yet, so it's such a great question. But here's what I would say about that. You have some people that, like, if you look at some people who can cope with change really well, and I'm sure there's some people in your lives, it might be you, that really seem to do well. Like when something has to change or has to evolve, like you do fine. Like you don't melt down, where some people really do melt down. So I look at it more on an individual level, like whether the coping skills are there, whether the grit and perseverance and resilience is there. So when you look at the research on grit, perseverance, and resilience, what you're looking at is, first of all, you're looking at mindset, that growth and fixed mindset I was talking about. But the other thing you're looking at, which is very interesting, is people that have to persevere through kind of trauma, difficulty, hardship, hard work, like things not just coming to them, tend to do a little bit better when faced with change or faced with having to do something a little bit differently. So if you look at some of the research on children, you know, when children are given a task and told like an unsolvable problem, right? And they're told to solve the problem. The kids that tend to give up very quickly, if you look back in their lives, those are kids that might have been told like, you're so smart, you're perfect, you know everything. They have this fixed mindset of being very smart, and so trying new things, they're going to give up quicker, because if you're trying something new that you've never tried, you're not smart when you're trying it, right? You mess up. Versus the kids that are kind of praised about the process, like, oh, okay, you're doing much better, like you did much better than yesterday, I like how you put these two problems together, they're going to be more likely to persist and to persevere through the problem. So you bring that into the workplace, your young adults who are leading companies or leading teams that have this grit and have this perseverance are probably going to be more comfortable with a constant changing motion, things constantly changing, than those people that identify themselves, their success with these fixed traits as like, well, I'm intelligent, or my brains, or whatever. So that's how I would talk about it. I hope I made sense when I just went off on that ramble.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. No, I appreciate that. I just want to say, like I heard, like in my child when we used to get this that a desperate situation requires desperate measures. So talking to these kids, like if you plunge them into some crisis, and the chances of that change to overcome will be more faster. And kids who have been spoon-fed as one of the smartest and genius, and they fail, and it's very difficult for these students to digest, like I failed, they never thought like fail is so bad, So thanks a lot. I appreciate for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. And failing is great. Failing is so important.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Jaffrey, for your
thank you, Dr. Muhammad.
The opportunity.
Thank you very much, sir, for being our usual caller. So let me go to another quick question from Mr. Raju Prasad. The question is, do you think monetary incentive is a good way to support change management process? Or what could be the future risks?
Wait, do I think what?
The monetary incentives is a good way to support change management process. What could be the future risks?
I don't like it. It's a question that I would have to think through a little bit more. But let's break down. Again, I'm sorry I keep on bringing psychology into this. But let's break down the psychology of money and motivating through money. So what we know about that is money is motivating up to a certain point, up to people's certain lifestyle that they want. After that, it becomes a demotivating factor. So when it comes to, and it can cause some problems when it comes to creativity and innovation, because when you start tying in incentives, monetary incentives to creativity or innovation or motivation or things like that, what you're doing is you're hampering that thought process, the creative and innovative thought process, because you're tying in someone's financial livelihood with that. And anytime we talk about money, you're talking about financial livelihood. So let's bring that to the change situation. When you have a change initiative, obviously the ideas in the boardroom are not necessarily going to translate 100% into the organization, right? There's going to be problems. There's going to be things that work, and there's going to be things that don't work. So your goal as a leader is to get people talking to you, not fearful of you. Get people talking to you, talking to each other about what's working, what's not. How can we be more innovative about this change? How can we be more creative? How can we make this work best? So if you start tying incentives to that, then you're tying financial livelihood to that, and then you're hampering that kind of thinking. So I would rather reward how teams work, right? I would rather reward like people persevering through the failure or persevering through the problems as they're figuring out the change. I would rather reward everyone, and it could be monetary, but like how we do as a whole company, that everyone reaps the benefit. I don't like and kind of celebrating these small wins. I don't necessarily like tying in the monetary incentives because again, it's short-lived. It's short-lived versus creating that internal motivation to make the team work better, to make the company work better.
Okay, well that really brings us towards the end of the webinar, Dr. Nicole. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
No, these were wonderful, wonderful questions, and you got me thinking. I'm going to go do some more research, and this was such a pleasure speaking to you all, and thank you so much for the wonderful questions and for listening in.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your time and for sharing this valuable presentation and information. So I would like to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, Mal, and hopefully we're going to have you again on a live session. So thank you very much once again. And thank you all of those who participated in this webinar for posting interesting questions. I know I missed out a couple of questions, but you can always get back to us and send your feedback via email. So please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org for our upcoming webinars. and to access the archive section. We are recording this webinar, which will be uploaded on the community.mile.org. Thank you very much. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you.